Hey guys, it's Jasper, and today I'm going to be reading you a fairy tale I love from W.B. Yeats' collection of Irish fairy and folktale. The story I'll be reading for you today is called The Brewery of the Eggshells, and it's about what a mother should do if she thinks or suspects her baby is a changeling. A baby that's been changed out from the fairies. Yeah, what's a mom to do? So if you're a new mom and your baby is crying and all of a sudden sickly, maybe it's a changeling, and here's a story about definitely what you shouldn't do, but in the Celtic tradition, you should do. W.B. Yeats collected these stories in the Irish countryside, and so for today's reading, I thought it would be fitting to have a little bit of an Irish whiskey. I've got Jameson Special Cask. It's obviously not a branded video, but some Irish whiskey we'll start off with today. So if you haven't already, pour yourself a glass of something and cheers. Hope you enjoy this reading of The Brewery of the Eggshells, collected by W.B. Yeats. The Brewery of Eggshells. The story is attributed to T. Crofton Crocker. Mrs. Sullivan fancied that her youngest child had been exchanged by fairies' theft, and certainly appearances warranted such a conclusion, for in one night her healthy, blue-eyed boy had become shriveled up into almost nothing, and never ceased squealing or crying. This naturally made poor Mrs. Sullivan very unhappy, and all the neighbors, by way of comforting her, said that her own child was, beyond any kind of a doubt, with the good people, and that one of themselves was put in his place. Mrs. Sullivan, of course, could not disbelieve what everyone told her, but she did not wish to hurt the thing. For although its face was so withered and its body wasted away to a mere skeleton, it had still a strong resemblance to her own boy. She, therefore, could not find it in her heart to roast it alive on the griddle, or to burn its nose with the red-hot tongs, or to throw it out on the snow on the roadside. Notwithstanding these and several like proceedings were strongly recommended to her for the recovery of her child. One day, who should Mrs. Sullivan meet but a cunning woman, well known about the country by the name of Ellen Lay, or Grey Ellen. She had the gift, however she got it, of telling where the dead were and what was good for the rest of their soul, and could charm away warts and wens and do a great many wonderful things of the same nature. "You're in grief this morning, Mrs. Sullivan," were the first words of Ellen Lay to her. "You may say that, Ellen," said Mrs. Sullivan, "and good cause I have to be in grief, for there was my own fine child whipped off from me of the cradle without much as a by your leave or ask your pardon, and an ugly donny bit of shrivelled up fairy put in his place. No wonder, then, that you see me in grief, Ellen." "Small blame to you, Mrs. Sullivan," said Ellen Lay. "But are you sure 'tis a fairy?" "Sure," echoed Mrs. Sullivan. "Sure enough I am to my own sorrow, and can I doubt my own two eyes? Every mother's soul must feel for me." "Will you take an old woman's advice?" said Ellen Lay, fixing her wild and mysterious gaze upon the unhappy mother, and after a pause she added, "But maybe you'll call it foolish." "Can you get me back my child, my own child, Ellen?" said Mrs. Sullivan with great energy. "If you do as I bid you," returned Ellen Lay, "you'll know." Mrs. Sullivan was silent in expectation, and Ellen continued, "Put down the big pot full of water on the fire, and make it boil like mad. Then get a dozen new-laid eggs. Break them and keep the shells, but throw away the rest. When that is done, put the shells in the pot of boiling water, and you will soon know whether it is your own boy or a fairy. If you find that it is the fairy in the cradle, take a red-hot poker and cram it down his ugly throat, and you will not have much trouble for him after that, I promise you. Home went Mrs. Sullivan and did as Ellen Lay desired. She put the pot on the fire and plenty of turf under it, and set the water boiling at such a rate that if ever water was red hot, it surely was. The child was laying, for a wonder, quite easy and quiet in the cradle. Every now and then, cock in his eye, that would twinkle as keen as a star on a frosty night over at the great fire and the big pot upon it. And he looked on with great attention at Mrs. Sullivan breaking the eggs and putting down the eggshells to boil. At last he asked, with the voice of a very old man, "What are you doing, Marmee?" Mrs. Sullivan's heart, as she said herself, was up in her mouth, ready to choke her at hearing the child speak, but she contrived to put the poker in the fire and to answer without making any wonder at the words. "I'm brewing a Vic." "And what are you brewing, Marmee?" said the little imp, whose supernatural gift of speech now proved beyond question that he was a fairy substitute. "I wish the poker was red," thought Mrs. Sullivan. But it was a large one, and took a long time heating. So she determined to keep him in talk until the poker was in the proper state to thrust down his throat, and therefore repeated the question. "Is it what I'm brewing? A Vic?" said she. "You want to know?" "Yes, Marmee. What are you brewing?" returned the fairy. "Eggshells, a Vic," said Mrs. Sullivan. "Oh!" shrieked the imp, starting up in the cradle and clapping his hands together. "I'm 1,500 years in the world, and I've never saw a brewery of eggshells before." The poker was by this time quite red, and Mrs. Sullivan seized it, ran furiously towards the cradle, but somehow or the other her foot slipped, and she fell flat on the floor, and the poker flew out of her hand to the other end of the house. However, she got up without much of time and went to the cradle, intending to pitch the wicked thing that was into the pot of boiling water, when there she saw her own child in a sweet sleep. One of his soft, round arms rested upon the pillow. His features were as placid as if their repose had never been disturbed, save the rosy mouth, which moved with a gentle and regular breathing. So there's so many things to love about this story. It's strange and it's wonderful. And if you know anything about the folklore behind the changeling, it's a very interesting story. And if you don't know anything about changelings, it's a great introductory story in which it introduces you to the anxiety felt by those who believed in the Celtic fairies, the anxiety of the influence of the fairies. Very often as a North American reader or even a contemporary reader, we romanticize the fairies. But when you read the Irish or Scottish folklore, when you read the Celtic folklore, you see there's great wonder directed to the fairies, but there's also anxiety about, if you don't leave out, it's important, to leave out a little bit of milk, a little bit of butter, as rations. Otherwise, they'll go and steal your whole cow. there's anxiety around if you don't protect your children, if you don't protect new mothers, they might be stolen away by the fairies. If you don't protect, you know, young girls, generally the ones named Bridget, they're stolen away by the fairies for fairy brides. And there's quite a bit of anxiety around the fairy folk and measures of protection. So yes, there is wonder, and yes, there is this great awe around the character of the fairy, but there is also these anxieties, and I can just see the birth of these stories around the idea of the changeling, that this baby that is misbehaving and awful isn't really your baby. The fairies have swapped him out, and so your baby is off with the fairies, and the baby you have there is just a duplicate. It's something that looks like your baby, but it's actually a fairy, and it's just messing with you because it's crying all the time, and it's sickly, and it's no good. But I can see sort of the birth of this story with, you know, new moms who are just frustrated, and they're just like, I don't know what's wrong with this child. It must be a changeling. So I can see sort of the birth of this story and where that might come from, in the frustration of a new mother, or just, you know, a lady who's just had too much time inside the house with the babies crying all the time. But at the same time, it's also just a horrifying story, because you have Ellen Gray, whose solution is, well, if you think your baby is a changeling, here's the thing to do. And it ends with, you know, telling Mrs. Sullivan that she should heat up a hot iron rod and cram it down that fairy's throat. It's a very violent image, especially because it's around, you know, babies and that sort of thing. But it's a wild story, it's a fun story, and it's a great example of the anxiety around a changeling baby. So I hope you guys enjoyed that story. I enjoyed reading it to you. I hope that my Irish accent that I tried to dip in there wasn't too bad. Practice makes perfect, and in truth I have not been practicing too much, and so yeah, I hope that you enjoyed it. And I hope that whatever you're drinking, that it's been good. If there's any fairy tales you guys would like me to read, comment down below. If there's any input you have on this story, comment down below. It's a good, fun story. I hope you enjoyed it. Cheers and good night.